Return of McCarthyism, ? A very special program jointly put together by United Chinese Americans and U.S. Heartland China Association. My name is Min Fan. I'm the executive director of the U.S. Heartland China Association.
Recording in progress.
From the Heartland region, we have rose many great leaders, but also characters like McCarthy. So
You're on mute.
Ming, please unmute yourself.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special program, Return of McCarthyism, brought together by United Chinese Americans. Okay. Is it good now? I kept getting muted. Okay. All right. Hello again. Welcome to Return of McCarthyism, ? A special program brought to you by United Chinese Americans and U.S. Heartland China Association. My name is Min Fan. I'm the executive director of the U.S. Heartland China Association. I am honored to turn this event very soon to the president and founder of United Chinese Americans and Hai Pei, who will moderate this event. But before we do that, let me turn to Governor Bob Holden, our chairman. Governor Bob Holden, you can unmute yourself and to give you opening remarks. Governor Holden, you need to unmute. Governor Holden. Here you are. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Min. I'm delighted to be with everybody today. In thinking about what I wanted to say to all of you, I came across the quote from Mark Twain: "History never repeats itself, but it rhymes." And how true that can be, not only for centuries and decades, but also yesterday and the day before, on down the line. So history does repeat itself. It does rhyme. We do have conflicts internationally. We've got paranoia, Cold War versus hot war. We have country differences, whether it be France, Great Britain, China, Russia, South and Central America, all across the board. And what we want to talk about is, how do we find the common ground? How do we understand that we must be able to communicate and work with each other if, in fact, we want to see our world go forward and be successful? We have two outstanding speakers with us today. Larry wrote the book on McCarthy. He's written several other books. All the work is extremely authenticated so that you can see exactly just how in depth he does in his work. In addition, we also have one dealing with an area that I'm comfortable with and know about, and that's Monsanto. And Mara, she's written that book, which is an extremely good book too. So we have two great authors today who are going to talk to all of us about the past, the present, and the future, where it needs to go, what we need to do, what changes need to be made. And I'm looking forward to all of it, because this is a time that our country and our world needs to sit down and figure out how we can work together to keep our world safe, our environment clean or cleaner than it is, and how we can provide an opportunity for the next generation to take the mantle and truly be leaders to help solve the problems around the world. So let me turn it over to Larry so he can start the real discussion of this day.
Oh, sorry, Governor Holden, just to jump in really quickly, I'm going to actually turn to our moderator, Hai Pei. And so thank you, Governor Holden, for your remarks. Again, given your recent recognition as inducted into the Missouri Public Service Hall of Fame, we're delighted that you can join us. Really quickly, Hai Pei is one of the most prominent Chinese American activist and champion. He founded Unite Chinese Americans. And I'm honored to turn this to Haipei to lead us through this discussion and featuring two prominent writers on the topic we all care about. Haipei, the podium is yours.
Haipei, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, welcome everybody. And it's such a lunch break time, and everybody join us for this event. Nothing is more timely than this talk, I would say. And just recently, as recent as yesterday, the New York Times has an article about the political atmosphere in Washington, D.C. That remind people very much of the 50s and the McCarthy era. You know, I myself is overseas, like a foreign student coming from China in the 80s to study in the United States. That was a very welcoming time, and is quite market different from today in my own life. So I was totally unprepared for this new phase of our country. So I was, you know, today we will have a dialogue quickly between Larry and Mara, and they will introduce their work for us, and then we will have some discussion, and followed by question and answers from the audience. Larry, I guess the floor goes to you first.
Okay, great. So most of our discussion today will be about what is going on with McCarthyism today, but I want to set a little context and remind people just who Joe McCarthy was. And I want to start out by saying that I wrote probably the 101st biography of Joe McCarthy. And one question anybody who looks at the book should ask is why the world needed the 101st book on Joe McCarthy. And I want to say that I had access to, for reasons of luck and being a pain in the neck and persistent, I had access to 3 kinds of materials that we had never seen before on Joe McCarthy. The first was all of his personal and professional papers that his widow left to his alma mater, which was Marquette University, shortly after McCarthy died. And she left them with a provision that they would become public when their infant daughter said they would become public. And for 60 years, she was saying either no or nothing, or when she died. And she was younger and healthier than me. So I didn't hold out much hope for those papers. But one day I got an email from the archivist at Marquette saying that she had decided, for a reason none of us were sure, to open up all the papers to me, and the day I stopped looking, to close them again. I also had access to 9,000 pages of transcripts of all the hearings that Joe McCarthy held behind closed doors. And 2/3 of the hearings that he held were behind closed doors. So suddenly we could look at what McCarthy was really saying when he thought nobody was looking. And the last set of papers showed up in an enormous brown box at the foot of my driveway in Cape Cod one morning when I was on the way out for a walk. And those turned out to be thousands of pages of Joe McCarthy's medical records showing how he lived his life and that he died of something very different than we knew about. So the bottom line is lots of new material, and what it all said was that Joe McCarthy, as bad a guy as we thought he was, we didn't know the half of it, and now we do. And as much as we had speculated that he had died of hepatitis, he in fact died of being a drunk. And for much of his career in the Senate and for all of his last years, he spent more time being drunk than being sober. And I think that explains a lot about who Joe McCarthy was. But I want to take you back with me for a minute, if you would join me, to a place called Wheeling, West Virginia, when Joe McCarthy launched the crusade that we're here to discuss today. And Joe McCarthy showed up at a very important event every year in the life of Republicans across the country. It was Abe Lincoln's birthday, and Republicans all over America get together every year to toast Abe Lincoln, to raise money, and to remind one another why they are Republicans. And prominent Republicans, if you were the president or you were a prominent senator, you got invited to deliver the Lincoln Day dinner in places like Washington or New York, like Chicago or LA. When you were Joe McCarthy, a backbench senator who looked destined to become a one-term senator, you got invited to Wheeling, West Virginia. And he showed up there that night with an enormous briefcase. And he had two speeches in his briefcase. One was a speech on national housing policy, which was something he actually knew a bit about. And had he delivered that speech that night, 70 years later, there's no way we would be back here talking about Joe McCarthy. But instead, he reached deeper into his briefcase and he pulled out a sheaf of papers and he held them up in the air with great drama. And he said, I have in my hand a list of more than 200 spies at our very own US State Department, and I'm going to name names. Now, what he in fact had in his hand that night might have been his wife's grocery list. It might have been some recycled set of documents from somewhere in Washington. But what we know today and what we know from seeing his newly unearthed private and professional papers is he didn't have any names of any communists that weren't known to the government already. But what he did was, within a day, he was on page 1 of every newspaper in America. And he suddenly went from being a backbencher who knew a little bit about housing and not a whole lot about anything else, and certainly nothing about communism. He went to being front page news in every newspaper, first in America and then around the world. And he never looked back. And what this suggests is that Joe McCarthy was the perfect opportunist. He knew how to grab an issue that was hot. He knew how not just to say, I have a number of communists that I think are infiltrating our government, but he knew that it was much more dramatic to actually name names. And if this starts to sound familiar in terms of anything that's going on in our world today, it ought to be, because lots of today's demagogues and the demagogues that followed for 70 years took their blueprints from Joe McCarthy and understood that all you really needed was a good ability to give a good speech. You didn't need facts, you didn't need truth. And I think that that is where we are left today. And I want to stop talking until we get to a discussion about today and turn it over to my wonderful co-panelist, Mara.
Hi, Mara. It couldn't be more appropriate that Mara can follow that historical, that history with the echo of our contemporary time. Mara's, she has extensive experience in China and working on the China Initiative, and have tracked some cases, and as recent as last month's trial in Tennessee on the Professor Emin Hu, amazing piece. Mara, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you. It's good to be here today. What Larry just said about Joe McCarthy waving documents into the air and you know how that's a way to kind of attract attention, whether or not what you're claiming is true. It makes me think of how FBI Director Christopher Wray says, you know, every few weeks it seems that the FBI is opening an investigation into China every 10 to 12 hours. And, you know, each time he makes headlines for that claim. And I always wonder, like, you know, what does that actually mean? Like, are there picture agents in headquarters in the dead of night opening an investigation at like 10 p.m.? But you know, that's a good example of a claim that every time he makes it, it is reported as news. even though he's made it many times. So I got interested in investigations into Chinese scientists when I was working in China as a correspondent for Science. I ended up writing a book called The Scientist and the Spy. But initially I was, based in Shanghai, and suddenly seeing this beat that I covered, make headlines in the U.S. and kind of trying to figure out what was going on. What I ended up putting together was a sort of look at the years leading up to the China Initiative, and then some of the history underlying discrimination against Chinese scientists in the US and problematic cases that go back decades. So I focused in particular on one case, which took place in the Midwest, and so may be of interest to many of you. It involved a man named Mo Hailong, who was accused of stealing corn from Monsanto. When I initially read about this case, the reports said that he had been caught red-handed in a cornfield outside Des Moines, that these trade secrets represented by the corn, genetically modified corn, were a national security issue of national security importance. The U.S. government had in fact used the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is supposed to be reserved for terrorism, issues of extreme national security importance, though it's abused. They used FISA in this case. There were car chases. The FBI flew surveillance planes overhead at one point. And so I got interested in why all of this work was done in pursuit of someone who was accused of stealing corn. And I'm from the Midwest as well. It was like a natural place for me to return to and go report out this book. But the pattern that I found in that case has played out in many other cases, where investigators pull out all the stops, all of these tools, even tools that would normally be reserved for cases of extreme national security importance, and effectively treat defendants like terrorists. And there was at that time already, this is pre-China Initiative, but there was already a lot of rhetoric being thrown around. Ray was talking about how the FBI had 1,000 investigations involving China and trade secrets theft in the work. Prosecutors would give press conferences where they would use very hyperbolic language, comparing people to foxes in a hen house. The media coverage was often fraught as well. I saw reports where defendants were likened to animals, so sort of like locusts in a swarm. This sort of language was fairly pervasive. And we can talk a little bit about this later. I think media coverage has improved somewhat, but this was a big problem even going back 5 or 6 years ago. And the case that I looked at in the book, there's no question that Mo Hailong was in that cornfield, that he, did attempt to steal corn from Monsanto. And so it's a little bit different from some of these cases, like those of Xiao Xixi, Sherry Chen, where, the government threw the book at somebody and they turn out to be completely innocent. But nonetheless, he was subject to a 3-year FBI investigation. The FBI bugged his vehicles. They dug through his trash. I mean, by looking at what happened to him, you get a sense for, what goes on in other cases. And part of the reason I chose this case was because of those unusual details of the degree of surveillance, the fact that the FBI flew airplanes overhead to track Mo Hailong. But another reason was, similar to the reason that Larry chose this topic. There were just hundreds and hundreds of pages of court documents available in the case, and that gave unusual insight into what the government had done in order to try to build its case. And like many recent cases, and like cases going back 10 years as well, the government came out, alleging everything short of espionage, alluding that he had committed some grave crime. He was charged with economic espionage, and in the end, he pleaded guilty, but the sentence was far less than the government had sought. And you see that pattern playing out in other cases as well. So I'm just going to quickly wrap this up, but as part of the research for this book, I wanted to understand the history of decision-making within the FBI and the context feeding into these cases. And what I found was I placed a Freedom of Information Act request and eventually got documents showing that there was a dedicated program to surveil Chinese scientists in the 1960s and 70s. It was fairly widespread. The aim was to compile an index of literally every ethnic Chinese researcher in the United States. This was under J. Edgar Hoover, appears to be his idea, but the surveillance continued into the 70s and the 80s, and then, to a lesser degree in the decades that followed. I wrote about that as well in an article for The Intercept, but some of that is in my book. And so that pattern of assuming that people were guilty because of their ethnicity did continue into the Wen-Ho Lee case and into the late 2000s and to the cases that you see today. So I am excited to talk about this further with Larry and also to address questions that you all may have.
Yeah, thanks, Samara. Since that our topic today is the return of McCarthyism ? I guess I kind of want to ask you both that do you think that McCarthyism has come back or not? It could be in light of the politics of our country in the last few years. And it could be, Mara, you're in Europe, and there's a lot of nationalistic movement in Europe too, with some very colorful characters. Or in terms of how our own government has conducted its China issues, including prosecution of Chinese American scientists. What do you think? Is it coming back, or it's almost back, or it's already back, or it's a total different?
So maybe I'll just jump in quickly. I want to read you, if I could, two quotes. And one quote is that candidate Donald Trump issued in 2006 when he boasted to his supporters, I quote, "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters." Maybe the most famous line in the 2016 campaign. Exactly 62 years before that, the most famous pollster in America, George Gallup, said this about Joe McCarthy and his supporters. And I quote, "Even if it were known that McCarthy had killed 5 innocent children, they would probably still go along with him. Now, I think it's not accidental that in 100 ways that we could talk about, but that I don't even need to talk about, that Joe McCarthy was channeled by Donald Trump and continues to be. We all know probably that there was an arrogant and brilliant young attorney named Roy Cohn, who was Joe McCarthy's protege, and exactly half a century later was Donald Trump's tutor. And Roy Cohn was the flesh and blood connection between Joe McCarthy and Donald Trump. Donald Trump instinctively got what made McCarthy a success. He knew he could wave sheafs of paper in the air and talk about all of America's troubles being immigrants pouring in from Mexico or trade secrets going out to China, and nobody ever would bother catching up with the facts of what was going on. It was just making the charge, and his supporters and enough of America would believe him. And I think it is scary, not just that Donald Trump has managed so successfully to channel this, and not just that he managed to be elected president doing that, but that yesterday in elections in Virginia and maybe in other places around the country, Donald Trump proteges showed that they can do something similar and win election. And it didn't go away when Joe Biden beat Donald Trump a year ago. It's still around. McCarthyism never died with Joe McCarthy, and it hasn't died yet with Donald Trump.
What an indictment. Right.
Yeah. Larry's comments made me think of, his comments on Trump made me think of this Committee for the Present Danger that Steve Bannon and others started a few years back. I don't know the status of it now, but I remember looking at the rhetoric of that committee and the whole framework, and it felt like it was straight out of the 60s. So, in terms of what happens when cases against Chinese scientists are brought, at the very granular level, I think it's often not. It's not so that there's such a great conspiracy or anything like that. But you have FBI agents in every field office around the country who've been tasked with finding instances of China stealing American technology. And so they go out often with not a lot of information and are then told to find perpetrators. And there just is not there's not training on bias, and the people that they very often come back with are ethnic Chinese. And I've heard again and again from, for example, I reported at MD Anderson Cancer Center after the FBI spent 18 months on campus. They actually still were on campus grilling people at the time that I started reporting there. And they just created this atmosphere of fear where, there were several people who were under investigation for not reporting ties to China, but their assistants and the people they worked with were also inexplicably put on leave. And all of them were ethnic Chinese. And, no one was ultimately charged. It may have been the case that there were people who had their grant filings, not all neatly filled out. But when the Bureau goes in and puts a dozen or more ethnic Chinese researchers all on leave, it gives this scrutiny. It gives this feeling that they are under scrutiny because of their ethnicity. When many have done absolutely nothing wrong.
We many of us know about that case. What what I'm curious about is you two, when you look at these cases, look at what has happened in our country in the last few years, do you see that how FBI or law enforcement during their work, doing their daily work, how is that different from in the 50s when Hoover is still there as director, or how much improved, or what's your view on our law enforcement way of doing business today, especially regarding in this case, as Mara have mentioned, the Chinese American scientists?
So Mara knows a lot more on how to answer your question, but I'm going to take a quick stab at it. And so it would be difficult not to improve FBI enforcement of the law from the Hoover era, because it was so seat of the pants and depending on his personal biases. But I think one of the things that I see as a through line from the 1950s to today is, in the 1950s, it was assumed that anybody whose politics were at all left of center were by definition stealing secrets and giving them to the Soviets, that they were traitors. They weren't just, so it became enough of a scarlet letter to just have politics that were left of center, that even today, 70 years later, lots of politicians in America hate to call themselves liberals for fear they'll somehow be branded as that will flow over into their being a socialist or a communist or being disloyal. And I think the same scarlet letter is applied to a lot of people of Asian American ancestry or scientists who have any ties to China, that is somehow being seen as melding quickly into somehow being traitorous. And I think that there were real leftists who were stealing secrets in the 1950s, but by the time Joe McCarthy came along, any of the 24-karat ones had already been uncovered. And one person joked in 1950 that if Joe McCarthy were dropped into the middle of Moscow's Red Square on May Day, he wouldn't recognize a real communist. And I think that was true. And I think that the incredible vitriol that people used in that era to label people communists without evidence is the kind of thing we're seeing today. And it's not just among Republicans, and it is certainly affecting an Asian American community. But I've exhausted the extent of my knowledge, and now we'll hear real facts from Mara.
Yeah, I mean, so similar to what you say about there were leftists in the 50s who were spies, right? So I see in the chat people asking, does China steal technology, and is it a conflict of interest when people are collecting U.S. grant money and also collecting money from the Chinese government? There are genuine issues here. The problem is in how they are addressed and how the FBI and the NIH go about fixing those issues. And one significant problem at the FBI is that it's not very diverse, and they have also managed to alienate the Asian American agents that are there. I spent some time talking to people who told me that they were told not to date Asian U.S. citizen women, not to hang lanterns at Chinese New Year, like not to have any kind of culturally significant items in their home. And I mean, this was the attitude within parts of the FBI. And so to have this organization that's not very culturally literate and that can't, adequately distinguish between people honoring their cultural heritage and people being somehow unfaithful to the U.S. nationality, I think that's a major issue. And when you have those kinds of pre-existing bias in the organization, it does shape the way they investigate cases.
Hi, Pei, can I just jump in with there's really wonderful stuff going on here in the chat, and I just want to jump on two issues that were raised there. One is the question of whether Joe McCarthy had a chilling effect in the 1950s that we even see some of today in terms of people, experts in our government on Asia. And I think they were called back then, those experts in the State Department were called this wonderful shorthand expression, China hands. And they were the experts on China and on Asia generally in the State Department. And they were purged under Joe McCarthy. They were, lots of them were called leftists. They were said to be too sympathetic to Mao and the Red Chinese who were taking over, and they were purged. And for a generation, we suffered ill effects. Now, it's too simplistic to say we got into the mess we got into in Vietnam because the Asia experts were missing from the State Department. But having said it's too simplistic, it also is true in part. And the people who knew Asia and who could have seen the subtleties of what was going on in Asia then were all out of the government. And it took a generation generally for the State Department to gear up again. And if that sounds familiar, it's because during the Trump era, lots of people were purged from the State Department. Either life was made uncomfortable enough for them, or just generally working for the government was seen as being an evil enough thing that lots of good people left the government. And I think it will take a while for us to restore that kind of expertise and credibility. I want to say one other thing, and I want to say it especially because Mara is here today. There was a question raised earlier in the chat, what about journalists? And aren't they the ones who have to sift fact from specious charges? And I think if in the last 4 or 5 years there have been any heroes in America, it have been the journalists. I'm not talking about journalists on the in the crazy cable shows who are partisans one way or the other. I'm talking about working real fact-based journalists like Mara and like the Washington Post and the New York Times. And they have been out there every day with fact-checking, with scouring, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, what they say and what really is substantiated. And I think that we don't spend enough time. We spend a huge amount of time today disparaging journalists and don't recognize that these are people like Mara who are working crazy hours. She just was on a deadline 2 seconds before she came on with us today. They're doing it under very difficult conditions made worse by COVID, and they're doing it, and I don't know what her salary is, but they're generally doing it for very little money. And they're doing it because they believe in something called the truth. And they're what separates us from real threats or even worse threats to our democracy.
Well, let's talk about that. What has changed? For one thing, I can say that I totally agree with you, Larry, that I'm so happy that you see that. I'm not so sure how many people out there see that our media this time around, I'm not talking about just the last few months, actually starting from the coverage of Sherry Chen and Xiaoxing Xi, the New York Times and Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal are it's really very, very encouraging, actually. And that little newspaper in Knoxville also played a very important role to go through every day and do the reporting. Something I can hardly imagine in the 50s. So maybe I was wrong on that, right? So what do you think have changed in terms of journalism, in terms of maybe our, even including law enforcement, including our judicial system, or our, just in general, some politics? Are we more tolerant? Are we more sensitive to minority communities? What are all the changes are there?
Well, I do think there's been a change in the past few years in terms of how this particular issue is covered. When I started looking into it, it was pretty rare that journalists would reach out to the defendant in the case when someone was charged. Or, maybe they attempted to contact their lawyer, but I honestly could not find any examples of defendants who had told their story until Xiao Xingxi came along. And, between Wenhou and Xiao Xingxi, there was almost nothing. There was a white professor at the University of Tennessee who had been given a whole kind of spread in Bloomberg after he got out of prison for allegedly taking technology to China. So that was it. And I think, now journalism is in, like other areas, has been in this reckoning over, prioritizing white voices over other voices, and, trying to broaden our sources, trying to also, increase the number of people of color who are working as journalists, and all of that's just happened in the past 2 years, and hopefully is having some positive impact. But at the same time, as people have noted in the chat, we're at a very low moment when it comes to U.S.-China relations. That's something for which I don't think the Trump administration, I think it bears a significant amount of responsibility, but it's also, in my view, a factor of a more difficult situation in China and a more assertive position in international relations. So you have these two countries kind of increasingly at loggerheads, and I'd be curious to hear from Larry how that played into McCarthyism in the 50s and 60s.
Sure. So I want to just say about journalism. It was journalists who were the people who brought down Joe McCarthy. There are a lot of people who claim to have done that. There were various senators, there was President Eisenhower, but it was really journalists. They, from day one, knowing they'd be kicked in the teeth, and he did kick them in the teeth, then, like today, journalists were the good guys, and back then it was mainly, sadly, guys. And to me, as a lifelong journalist, with journalism being the closest thing I think I have to a religion, I'm glad to see that journalists are doing the same thing today, and they were kicked in the teeth by Donald Trump and others, but they get back up and keep doing that. But I want to say that my book, while it is a biography of one of the most vile characters in American history, it is at bottom a good news story. And the good news is that demagogues, be they Joe McCarthy or Donald Trump, Americans sadly still buy into them, but eventually we see through them and we do away with them. And I'd like to think that someday we won't buy into them in the first place, but it is very encouraging to me that we're discussing Joe McCarthy in the past tense, and as somebody who had a very steep downfall, and that much as he would like to come back to power, and we'll have to wait 3 years to see whether he does, we're discussing Donald Trump, the demagogue, as the ex-president Donald Trump, and he's being investigated by journalists all over the world in terms of things. And it just, we don't always get things right, but in the end, it seems like we come out right. And I hope that that continues to be the case.
I kind of still want to go back a little bit into history while Larry's here. in the 50s, we have something called a Red Scare. We have talked about this in private. I think at that time, Chinese community has had its share of that Red Scare. Some of the Chinese has been investigated without good reasons. Some in the Chinese community has been harassed, some being expelled, some have been detained, all of that. I'm not really sure there was one Chinese spy has been found by our government. Now, so is the larger Red Scare, which is mostly actually you would look at a real person and their ethnic background. Many of them are Jewish. And that Red Scare, and with some kind of targeting on Jewish community, that's where you kind of easier to profile things like that. What is, I don't know whether during your research, Larry, and for the same matter, Mara, is there any similarities in how that two community has gone through, or why we're made easy target?
Yes. So I want to start by saying that Joe McCarthy was an equal opportunity slanderer. He slandered Jews and too many leftists and Jews. And after the Rosenberg famous spy case, it became easier for him to become openly anti-Semitic. He was anti-gay. He was anti-Russian, and he was very much anti-Asian. But any group that he saw as vulnerable, as lacking the political clout that he would pay a big price in taking them on, he took them on. And there is the lesson today. It is groups that politicians see that they can scapegoat and blame for everything that goes wrong. So for the last 4 years, when we did anything from lose a trade secret to develop a pandemic, it was easy for Donald Trump to point the finger and say the same thing. It is Chinese Americans, it's Asian Americans, it is outsiders and foreigners. And he understood from all the demagogues who came before how that works. And for all the people that will say, geez, that's unfair, you're labeling a whole group and you're doing it without evidence, it didn't matter, because the next day he'd come up with a new outrageous charge and the press would be hard pressed to go back and look at what he said the day before, because they were trying to keep up with his latest tweet. And he did it more effectively than Joe McCarthy, because McCarthy had to wait for the next morning's newspaper. Donald Trump could stay up all night and be tweeting, and every journalist who I knew who was covering him said they never got any sleep because they were afraid to go to bed because they'd missed some new outrage.
Yeah, I guess I would I would like to say something about the difference between espionage and economic espionage and grant fraud, because I think these are very often conflated by U.S. intelligence officials to inflate the threat from China. I think in terms of espionage, it is true that we're in a moment of U.S.-Chinese tension, and that China, like the U.S., has a very sophisticated intelligence apparatus. They rolled up the CIA's network in China a few years ago. There are concerted attempts to spy. Where this all goes too far is that economic espionage, theft of trade secrets, and lesser crimes like grant fraud, leaving out information on a grant application, for example, these have all gotten kind of swept up under the same umbrella as espionage. And I appreciate Larry's owed to journalists earlier, but journalists often fail to distinguish among the three. So when you look at like the trade secrets theft, the case that I featured in my book, very often what's happening in these cases involving corporations is that the US corporations are very large companies like Monsanto, which was then a US corporation. It's now owned by Bayer. Have an interest in bringing charges of trade secrets theft against scientists at rival companies. And so effectively what the US government has done has taken on the interests of large corporations. It's helping them advance their own IP battles. And at the same time, that fight has gotten kind of swept up in this rhetoric of we're being tough on China. When you actually dig into many of these corporate cases that have been brought, they may involve a defendant who's ethnic Chinese, but there's no clear tie to the Chinese government. Even in a case like the one I wrote about where the person pleads guilty, it's still not clear that this is about that deep down, this is really about some deep-seated threat from China. And similarly with the grant fraud cases that have been brought under the China Initiative, there are many instances of researchers who have failed to report ties. But like, are they agents for the Chinese government? And that's the rhetoric that gets used sort of suggests that they are. And that's where the problem lies. That you have all of these somewhat minor, still federal crimes, but more relatively minor offenses when you compare it to extreme issues of national security like espionage, and they're getting kind of swept up under the same umbrella.
Yeah. So can I say one quick thing? I'm seeing that there are two sets of questions that are coming up in the chat that I'd like to address. One is that Mara and I are biased and that we're from the same side of things. And the other is the question of what can be done today. And I'd like to discuss the bias and what can be done today in what I hope will be a very brief answer. So we are biased, and I think we're anti-demagogue, not necessarily anti-Republican. And I want to just go back for a minute to history. Joe McCarthy was a Republican, and the Republicans helped enable his rise to power, but they also did him in the end. It was not the Democrats who brought him down. The Democrats showed a surprising lack of courage in taking him on. LBJ, who was the head of the Democratic Party in the Senate at the time, said, we're not going to, go at him in a frontal assault. We're going to wait till Republicans are willing to go after him, and then we'll help them. And that's what happened. It was Dwight Eisenhower and the Republican Party in the end that said to Joe McCarthy, you've gone too far, and that facts matter, and the truth matters. And I think today, it's not Republicans that are demagogues. It is Donald Trump and his acolytes who are. And I think someday, and it may be in 3 years or it may take longer, the Republican Party, the same way it did in 1950, will reclaim its better nature, will say that truth matters again, and we will again have two parties competing based on facts rather than on scapegoating. And being anti-Trump doesn't mean being partisan. It means being anti-demagogue.
Well said. In terms of my own perspective, I was a journalist in China. It's really not an easy place to be a journalist, to get information. I to this day, cover human rights issues. I cover the expansion of surveillance technology globally, including in China. When I started this book, I had no I was just interested in, I'd spent a lot of time with Chinese scientists in China because I was then a correspondent with Science. And I was interested in why suddenly all of these indictments were being brought. I didn't have a foregone conclusion. And I did spend a lot of time with the FBI talking to the lead agent on the case that I wrote about. Went to national security conferences. I made every effort to talk to the people on every side of the issue. The only people who would not talk to me for the book were executives at Monsanto, to be honest. And so this is the conclusion that I reached after looking at all these angles, was that a lot of these cases were overblown. And, that's my own conclusion, but I'm just giving you a little information on how I got there.
Yeah, Mara, I have always had some problems with our law called economic espionage. I think that needs to be and must be sooner or later to be amended. For those stuff you don't know, when our government says we have charged this many cases who are spying for China, things of that, there's a category within the economic espionage law that actually does not require perpetrators to be supported by alien governments or with the intent to help a foreign government. So it's a mom and pop operation. And you know what? Most of the cases of these Chinese espionage, economic espionage cases are filed under that category. So if you take that on, I don't know why that category is there. If you take a serious think, economic, the E word, espionage E word, you could not associate the two things together. So anyway, that's a more technical thing.
So right, if you look back to when the law was passed in 1996, I think originally it was envisioned as the U.S. government would bring cases where there was a clear connection to foreign governments, but it just hasn't played out, and they have not been able to let those charges stick.
Right. So you actually, Larry, already you took my topic just now, and I'm glad that we didn't in your previous round to delve into that. What I think what we all are interested here is when things like this happening around us here, in other parts of the world, in Europe, I don't know, maybe even in China. What can citizens or NGOs like UCA, like U.S. Heartland China associations, what can we do? What kind of historical precedents that you think we can take a page from today?
So I think there are three things we can do. One is we can read and learn. The second is we can vote. And the third is even more important than voting is we can be activists and speak out on things that matter. And we think that we're more divided than ever today, and it's really difficult to do that. But that's just forgetting our history. We were incredibly divided, and things were vituperative, and everybody was angry at one another back in the 1950s during the Red Scare and the Cold War and all of that. And the lesson was that it was not journalists and not the president who ultimately decided the fate of the demagogue then. It was the public. And that is why the public gives politicians the confidence to do what they ought to do. It is us who can do all of this. And that sounds maybe naive, and it sounds maybe too optimistic, but it worked, and it's worked. We have had demagogues throughout our history, starting in the days of the American Revolution, and we've had them continuously. And in the end, the people always prevail, and I'm convinced with a little help from some journalists, they will do it again.
Yeah, and just to expand on what Larry said, I think great journalists we've done our best, but it has really been the activism of the Chinese American community that has brought this issue onto the stage. And I think that is part of the reason that the narrative is starting to shift. When I reported my book, I really benefited from people like Hai taking the time to educate me about the issue. So in my effort to talk to people on all sides and learn as much as I could about the issue, I also spoke with people. There was a lot that I did not know about the history of anti-Asian racism, and just having those discussions was incredibly helpful. And I think that has also been a big reason that there's more awareness of some of the issues in these cases.
So can I just do a quick last shout out? I did a shout out to Mara in journalism. I want to do one to Bob Holden and good people who go into government. And people not being afraid to do that really matters. And I want to do a last shout out to UCA, because you're probably going to get a lot of blowback from some of the people who are on this session saying, why do you have biased speakers like this? But I think you're not afraid to take on an issue like that.
Chinese organization, that it's a Chinese group that is, hang on.
What's going on? Go ahead, Larry.
Anyway, no, I've said it, and I think that you're a courageous organization to take on controversial issues that sometimes seem partisan, but that's not the controversy. The controversy is against fact and lies, and that's what the issue is, and that's what you help bring the truth to issues like this. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Larry and Amara, for that. Actually, when the Sherry Chen case broke out, when the government has dropped her charge, and we went to the Capitol Hill and did some events, and in supporting of a clear, 100% clear-cut case. We still got some people complaining, oh, she must have done something wrong. Otherwise, why government would be interested in her in the first place? Things of that nature. I really see that, despite of all this gloom, and we are seeing a lot of old tactics coming back, and the U.S.-China really, we're probably going to be prepared for a very, very long haul of a total confrontation between two countries. I hope that's not the case, but if that is the case, and that even most likely will be the case, there will be a lot of more developments like this. There will be more demagogue. I can bet my house on that. But I see the positive signs too. Nonprofits, NGOs come up much stronger compared with the 50s, right? I would say that, Larry, right? And as you said, our media, our reporters are so much better. I have to say, I'm personally really very much impressed and very grateful for what they have been doing. And I think even in terms of makeup of U.S. Congress, where you have a very powerful kind of CAPAC, Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, which has played a pivotal role in many of these cases and in Washington politics. Just about 3 days ago, CAPAC has met with Attorney General Garland and his deputies. And during these cases, these talks, they have pressed China Initiative and others, right? So we do see some progress. And there's also some very brave African-American member of Congress, Jewish American member of Congress who stood up on our behalf. So if you see all this, you still see some hopeful signs and the progress our country has come along.
And in Boston, we just elected Michelle Wu mayor.
Oh my
That's
Lord!
Not a bad. That's a pretty extraordinary thing.
Is this bringing politics into this? Or
It
no?
is, absolutely, it is.
But
yeah, and there are. I mean, I think you can see also we report on the FBI fairly extensively at The Intercept, and the China initiative and the treatment of Chinese American scientists is sort of in its own category. But at the same time, the FBI has labeled Black activists, Black identity extremists. And, so there is this tendency that goes beyond just Chinese Americans to kind of categorize people and discriminate against them based on race and ethnicity. And so, I think it's also important to understand that larger context.
Right. And Larry, you want something to say?
Oh, just a last word from me is read Mara's book. It is not just reading journalism, but reading people when journalists have the time to go deep the way you do in a book. Read her book.
Well, we have some time for some question and answers. I don't know whether either Fanming or Qihong, you have some. Yeah, we see some hands raised, right? Could we? Do you know which one we should go next? We'll give our audience some time.
Yeah. You should, let's see, there's a participant BA, and you should be able to speak. If you raise your hand, we will let you, yeah, please go ahead, speak. Please raise your hand.
Please unmute yourself.
While we wait for her to get ready, there is a question about,
okay.
Oh, you ready? Please go ahead.
Yes. My question is, thank you very much. I know everybody's talking about the racial profiling for the scientists, but I also realize under China initiative, you also have other people who's not scientists, but also possible being racially profiled. I just wonder if anybody has any thoughts on those. Thank you.
Interesting question. I personally know some cases where there's some problem with the visas, and it's just purely technical visa cases. But the government has brought in our other law enforcement rather than immigration, like ICE, brought in FBI and things of that nature. And the person I know, the case is the same day she lost a court appeal, and on her way back home, she was arrested right outside her home. She was interrogated by FBI and before. So, and I asked a very senior immigration lawyer, and that lawyer told me things of this almost never happens. That somebody just run out of their legal status in this country on the first day, and ICE is waiting right outside their door to catch her because she was suspected because of her school was a military medical university in China. So they are highly suspicious of people with that kind of background. So again, that's the only case I know of.
I think we had racial profiling here. I was joking a minute ago about Michelle Wu and the mayor's race in Boston, but there was during that campaign an effort by her opponent to do what a lot of people, including the Boston Globe, thought was racial profiling by suggesting in ads that she was an outsider. And the outsider was, it was supposedly that she wasn't born in Boston and that she had moved here, but it was a lot more than that. And it was using this sense that she didn't talk with the proper Boston accent and that she was somehow not one of us. And I think that that was a very clear-cut case. And so I haven't seen the final numbers, but she was winning by 30%. And I think hopefully that will tell some people that just doesn't work anymore. as an issue, at least here in this case in this time.
So Haipei, there's a question that I want to ask. It was actually a joke that was told to me that on one Halloween, a friend wore an old Chinese army jacket. And then people are like, hey, who are you? You're not Hulk, you're not Shrek. And he said, well, I'm a communist. So the joke was that nothing scares Americans more than a communist. Do you think that is still the case, especially with Biden's administration talking about the ideological divide in the world? Mm-hmm. Is that warranted? And what is the root of that deep fear?
Well, it is a bit absurd at this point because, the Chinese government is hardly like truly communist in its policies. But I do see like rhetoric from congressional Republicans that would call it communist China all the time, and certainly Trump did that a fair amount. And so, that is a deliberate trope.
And the root of it, it probably goes back deeper, but I think the root of it is there have been a number of Red Scares throughout American history. The one that was most inflamed was just predating Joe McCarthy at the end of World War II, and it worked enough. And when McCarthy came along, know-nothing, opportunistic Joe McCarthy, all he had to do was grab onto that single issue, and all across America, politicians were being elected on an anti-red platform. The truth is, America never had a communist party that numbered more than in the tens of thousands, and it never really threatened to take power, but it was this symbol, it was the easy scapegoat, and it worked well enough then that it's continued to be used. I thought we had outgrown that. I will confess that a week before the 2016 election, I had signed up to write a very different book, not the book on Joe McCarthy, a biography of a guy named Barack Obama. And I had signed up with my publisher, and the week after the election, a story that I thought was the story of ancient history in America, which was demagoguery and Red Scares, it became clear that that was the story not just of yesterday, but of today. And I got out of my contract for Obama and got into a contract for Joe McCarthy. And every day that I was working on that book, I had to remind myself whether what I was reading was documents from 70 years ago or from 70 minutes ago, because the story seemed so similar.
Wow.
Yeah, I had a somewhat similar experience where I was writing my book during the Trump administration and watching developments kind of with horror. And yeah, it was unnerving for everyone who lived through that period.
And then one more time, let me say that UCA, we are not interested in partisan politics. We do not take any position on partisan politics. And we actually have a pretty sophisticated view about both parties' strengths and weakness as it relates to Chinese American communities. However, I have to say this, even despite of the fact that I try to run away from politics as far away as possible, that just give a footnote evidence to what Larry just said, that during the last election cycle, every single Republican senatorial candidate had to spend a huge amount of money doing the China thing. Every single one of them, I counted personally, because there's only a few Senate races last time. It is really scary stuff. And the way they talk about it is many of them are very, very irresponsible, to say the least. Yeah. And that made the difference. That made the difference in the country. Yeah.
We have a question from Liu Ping. Please.
Yeah, go ahead, Liu Ping.
Yes. Larry, I have a question for you. I like you mentioned history. You mentioned that the 100 books, but you add one more. I will definitely read your one. but I've had no time to read the books on McCarthyism before because I'm a scientist. You know, the general question I have is, from my knowledge, what I have learned, owning Hitler, the Nazi, and Mao during the Cultural Revolution, who chased and drove scientists away. You know what happened? In my research area, I know 5 of very, very established scientists left this country permanently in the past 2 years. So, as you know, as a scientist, I do not understand how this have happened in this country. You know, we came to this country for 2 things. One is science, one is freedom. But now we are losing these 2 things. So as I think you may know a lot more than I do because you studied the history. So that's my general question.
So all I want to say, I don't know anymore, and you're the scientist. As scary as it is, you knew personally scientists who left because of that. When you start multiplying that by the numbers who didn't come during that time, either because they weren't admitted or because this didn't look like a very open place that they wanted to be, those numbers get scary. That is precisely what we saw in the 1950s. During World War II, we had been the beneficiary of all the people who were running away from Hitler and all the extraordinary scientists who came to America. Lots of people started wondering whether they belonged here because Joe McCarthy made things so unpleasant for them. And I hope that, again, the good news part of this story shines through again. It's not that McCarthy existed, which we all know about. It's that we outgrew him and toppled him. And I hope that's what we're going to look back in 2 years or 5 years or whatever and say, once again, it looks like demagoguery may be a story of our past and not of our future. And maybe that's naive and too hopeful, but it's because of all of you and because of journalists and people of courage who stand up and say no, not no to a particular partisan interest, but we can all, I hope, get behind saying no to demagogues.
Yeah, I too have heard stories of scientists, many stories of scientists who have left the United States to go to China or go to other countries because the climate has gotten difficult here, or because, you know, other people were investigated at their institution. And that is really the ironic effect of all of this, that, you know, it ends up helping the Chinese government's recruitment efforts, which is, you know, this is the FBI and the DOJ's stated goal is to counter the growth of Chinese science apparatus. And so, you know, if they actually end up driving people back to China, then you have to question, well, is there any utility in all of this? And, you know, so there are even people, I should say that there are people within the intelligence community who also see a need for reform. You know, people who very much believe that intellectual property theft is a threat, but who nonetheless think that we need to reform the China Initiative and also change how these investigations are uncovered. You know, for people in intelligence agencies whose job it is to work on counteracting China, to them also the news that all of this is driving people back to China is very bad news.
Yeah, my feeling is just kind of like a paradox. You know, politicians think what they are doing is completely correct. Okay, then it really reminds us that we will be like the Japanese during the World War II, okay, we will be all in jail, then or in the camp, okay. Then who you should blame? You should blame Japanese government or U.S. government. You have nowhere to blame. Then you just accept the fate. That's something we already become the second class. So next step is enemy, or I don't know. I have no answer. That's why I want to learn from you guys.
We heard you. Well put it. I'm one of, I guess, like you. I come to this country for its science or social science, and for its freedom, and both are in some way in trouble. And okay, can we go to the next?
Can you mute yourself? You can start talking.
Okay. My name is Yu Gas. I'm from New York. And what I see this one, the McCarthyism, the new phase in now is a China initiative. And the difference, the very, very big difference is the China initiative redefined the spy as called a non-traditional collector. This is covered extremely broad phase. All the student, faculty, whatever, scientist, engineer, if you have you're a Chinese descendant, you are under this big umbrella, say non-traditional information collector. And by saying that, you are, the generator is not really saying you have to be arrested. When you arrest somebody, go to court, you need evidence. However, you generate this group of people are not trustable. When you generate this, you don't need any evidence. Just say these are not trustable. So now a lot of companies, they are afraid to hire any Chinese people or whatever, not because they think you are not qualified, not because of discrimination. They just don't want to get in more trouble. And I saw this FBI even had one document say they help university administrative people, give them workshop, tell them how to monitor, give surveillance to the Chinese people. Say, if they did anything, somehow you just tell them how to monitor and how to report. And you have to report as the whole institution, their behavior, So this is I think this is a big problem. Not simply just arrest somebody. Arrest somebody, you need evidence, go to court, okay? But they untrust, it doesn't need any evidence. That's a big...
I think they got your point, yeah. Really appreciate your very, very good point. Any response?
I guess I would say that this idea of non-traditional collector goes back to the 1990s, if not earlier. And I looked into some of the literature that framed like the theory that the FBI was using for Chinese espionage, and the idea of going back decades has been that there is a kind of army of informal collectors. The actual metaphor was, that if you look at the collection of sand on a beach, China would just send all of its people to the beach to each take back a grain of sand, and that they would somehow bring this all back to China, and that it would be, assembled back into the beach. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but this was the actual theory. Among some quarters of the FBI, and it's highly problematic because there may be some people who freelance or moonlight as intelligence collectors. It encourages agents to see all ethnic Chinese people as suspect, and it of course it harkens back to previous racist theories and ideas. So there's a long history there.
So all I want to say is that nobody ever was convicted or went to jail because of charges that Joe McCarthy brought. And that is reminiscent of what's going on today. He didn't care about convicting anybody or putting them in jail. He cared about raising his profile and shouting and having people listen, and they did listen. And thankfully, there were courts that eventually acquitted them. But
we are come to the end very soon. We're just going to be having one or two questions, and please do a quick ones. Stephen, I see your hand raised. Stephen is UCA's board member and the founding chairman. Stephen?
Larry, very nice to learn what you were telling us today. I'm an engineering professor. I'm actually writing a book chapter on racial profiling in academia. So I would very much like to contact you to get some of your background information into my book chapter. But in addition, I want to share with you that there was a letter written by 177 Stanford faculty members, including 8 Nobel laureates, to Attorney General less than 2 months ago. And it was supported by letters from 214 UC Berkeley professors, another letter from 169 Temple University professors, and 198 Princeton faculty professors. That's 20% of their faculty population. Today, another letter is going to Attorney Garland. This is a letter signed by faculty and staff from over 200 universities across the country, including all 50 states and Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, requesting the end of the China Initiative. Thank you.
Stephen, I'll put you together with Larry. That's easy.
So can I just say one quick thing? If this were back in 1950 and Joe McCarthy, he would have taken all those letters and he would have said, it just shows you not that these professors are right, but that they're all communists. And that is what he did. And he went after a guy who had been the president of a school called Lawrence University in his hometown of Appleton, Wisconsin. And this guy was named president of Harvard. And when he was at Lawrence, he was okay. When he was at Harvard, he called Harvard the Kremlin on the Charles. And it was the smarter you were and the better university you were at, the more you became a target of his.
All right, let's, Ye Hong, can you be quick? Yeah.
Yeah, I have 2 quick questions. First, thanks very much for US.
I do that for one. Yeah, thanks.
Well, no, the China Social Initiative, this seems to launch in very quickly, and like, but I bet there's a secret or coordinated efforts that are leading to that launch. And then relatedly, that those people individual people, they are targeted, they're either cases to crack, or they are really strong in the field, so they want to target the people who are really strong in the field. It seems like from competitor. But there seems very limited information out there that reporting this. Now, can you comment on then how the initiative was launched and how those people were targeted? Thank you.
Mar, I know nothing about what the coverage has been like. What do you?
Sorry, can you explain one more time? Yeah.
I know nothing about the background on how much coverage there's been to the China Initiative, but you've been at the center of it.
Yeah, I mean, so, the China Initiative has built on years of investigations, a kind of informal effort by the Justice Department to bring cases connected to China. And I think what a lot of media coverage has missed is that there was this momentum there previously. It wasn't, the China Initiative wasn't some kind of fluke creation of the Trump administration. It certainly has gone much further than what was there before. but the foundation was already in place. And in the past few months, I've seen a lot of interest and a lot of pretty careful coverage of the initiative among colleagues.
I hate to say that we need to wrap up here now. I see a long list of hands there. Many of them are my friends. I want to apologize. We won't have time to do this today. Really appreciate your being here with us. And this is a huge issue, and an issue that's going to be with us for, as I said, a long, long, long time to come. And we could even get worse. And so we need all be prepared. And thanks so much again. For Mara and Larry, you are the lights to our life, and we need you. We really need every bit of help we can find. So the best we can do is to buy some books from you both. I have ordered Larry's Demagogue. It should be somewhere in my home. I haven't been back home for quite a few days now, but I have carried with me Mara's book, Science and That's Why. I'm in Boston now, and I have that book in my backpack. That just tells me how much I view that book. And today's event is a great collaboration between United Chinese America and our sister great partner organizations called U.S. Heartland China Association. It's a wonderful, wonderful, amazing groups are doing a lot of tough job in the heartland of this country. And technically, I want to thank Xiao Xiao and Qi Hong for your great work on this. But most importantly, actually, we're missing one person called Zhang Jiang. She has been doing most of the groundwork, contacting Mara and Larry, and did a lot of work. Jen, I want to give you a applaud of the hands, and thank you again for that. And so we will give our distinguished governor, Bob Holden, the last word.
Well, hi, Pei. Thank you very, very much. And I want to thank all the participants, those that asked the questions and those that gave the answer throughout the entire discussion. I kept thinking about if we could take and boil down into a 30-minute, 45-minute overview of the discussion and had that displayed in every one of the schools, elementary schools across the country, they would have a much different understanding maybe of the discussion that we're having today and the problems we as a nation are having. Because that's where we've got to get to. We've got to get to the future generation of leaders and let them know there is a different path than what some of these people that Larry and Mara talked about today. And I want to applaud everybody that participated, everybody that's engaged, but now is not the time to declare victory. Now is the time to think about how do we move forward and how do we develop the foundation so thoughtful discussion can once again be occurring in our culture, and so good public policy can be drafted, made, and exercised, because it's in not only our future as a nation, it's the world's future. And we've got to figure out how to make this sink into the minds and the hearts of people across our world. I've been active for over 40 years with the American Legion Boys State and Girls State program in Missouri. For the first time in the history of that organization, 80 some odd years, I convinced them to send a group of students to China. And we received a group of students from China into the Girls State and Boys State program. That does a tremendous amount of educating on really the things that you've been talking about all day today. It allows us and them to see each other as human beings. One of the kind of side notes, I found out a few years ago that a gentleman I know married a woman in China, brought her back to the United States along with her children. And a couple years later, one of the girls got selected to go to Missouri Girls State. and she got put up by the Girl State people as being their candidate for governor. She got elected as their candidate for governor, and then they found out that she wasn't even an American citizen. That tells you that if you connect with the right people, good results will happen. And your work today, your comments today, helps build that connection across our country and to the world. So thank you very much for all of it.
That's the end of our program today. Hope we'll do more of this nature. And thanks again, everybody, for attending this event today. And especially thanks goes to Mara and Larry.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for hosting us.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for hosting.
And read Larry's book too.
Yeah.
Larry,